A very warm welcome back to SNS, Sweden's leading independent research-based think tank. And my name is Mia Horna-Brandtjen, and I'm the CEO of SNS. We have an online version of the Tylösand Summit this year. And we're very happy that we're able to see so many of you here today. As you all know, the overarching theme of the conference is climate change. In a number of sessions, we are discussing issues like the energy challenge, the cost of climate change policies, the role of international trade and financial markets, and then also issues that we're going to talk about today, global cooperation, and also what we can learn from the pandemic. But just before we start, apart from being online this year, we also have another change. After approval from the speakers, we have decided to record our sessions and to put them, make them available online after the conference. And this means that the Chatham House rules that normally applies will not be used this year. But as always at SNS, we do encourage you to ask questions. You can do it verbally by raising your hand function, and also in written questions with the Q&A function that you find on your screen. And you can put questions, written questions, all along the different presentations, of course. So our keynote speaker today has extensive experience from global climate cooperation and negotiations and many other issues on the international scene. In your capacity as CEO of Sustainable Energy for All and the United Nations Secretary General Special Representative for Sustainability for All, you led the UN's effort towards greater access to clean and affordable energy. Before that, you were the Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank and the bank's Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the bank's group's effort to shift its operation and also to campaign for the Paris Agreement. And since a year, you're the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. You're warmly welcome. The floor is yours. Please, Rachel.
Mia, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I'm really privileged and honored to be with you at this Tylösand Summit and to be speaking to all of you at SNS and everybody online. Perhaps the benefit of our new world is that I'm zooming into you from Boston, Massachusetts, and haven't burnt any carbon to come and be in the warmth of a Swedish welcome. I'm going to share my screen in order to just go through a few slides to illustrate my key points. I'm going to stay at a fairly high level in a short period of time to cover a number of issues. And I know that the next two speakers have deep and specific expertise that will bring their perspective onto this interesting topic. We're actually, if we cast our mind back to the beginning of this year before the pandemic hit, we were in the middle of a conversation around two very specific global economic challenges, the likes of which we'd never seen before. One was obviously the need to decarbonize quickly and to do so in such a way as we didn't leave anyone behind. And the second was the corrosive impact of inequality within economies. The IMF was increasingly raising its rhetoric around both of those issues. And this was really what was on the minds of global leaders as they gathered in Davos, as they normally do each January. On the margins of those meetings were the first briefings about a potential zoonotic pandemic. But we now have to stand back with COVID wreaking economic havoc, as well as posing public health challenges and an extraordinary health crisis. We have to stand back and think about the interlocking nature of these crises. And in fact, at their origin, they all in their origin find a discussion around the role of our relationship with nature as a species. But they are compound crises. They build on each other. They are interlinked. And it has been interesting to see that COVID has actually tested our understanding of resilience. You can't self-isolate from a pandemic. It doesn't matter how rich you are. If the people who serve you, who are vulnerable and on low incomes, are exposed to the virus, then you're not safe. And you can't self-isolate from the impacts of climate change either. You can't self-isolate from what we've done in the destruction of nature and the loss of biodiversity. We've been able to see that some of the global systems upon which we depend are extremely irresilient. Our global energy system, our food system, both in the north and in the south. So while we've seen huge disruption and a real threat of famine across sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen in the United States 4, 5, 6 mile long lines of people in cars looking for food parcels. Some of the brittleness of those systems doesn't bode well for the way in which we will attack climate change in the years to come. And our financial system is really being pushed to the brink. The global economic challenge of having more than 95 countries come to the IMF for assistance at the same time, the nature of the debt, that it's not just public, it's public and private, in the household, the indebtedness of Africa at a time where we need to invest in green infrastructure. These are compound crises. I think it's also clearly strained our multilateral cooperation. We've had an insipid G7 and G20 in a year where normally this would have been a focus of extraordinary activity. And if we cast our mind back to the financial crisis of 2008, we saw individual multilateralists, committed multilateralists in important roles, Pascal Lamy at the World Trade Organization, Bob Zoellick at the World Bank, and we saw galvanized leadership from the countries themselves, including Gordon Brown at the in the UK. We haven't seen that level of urgency come through. And in fact, even the conversations at the World Bank and IMF meetings lacked something of a sense of urgency. In the last week or so, we've seen the biggest ever summit of public development finance institutions. And what was important there was, I think, there was an extraordinary innovation on display about how public development finance can help build resilience so that we can cope with COVID and cope with future crises. But we weren't able to bring forward a communique that had that urgency in it. And in fact, we had multilateral development banks watering down language around the commitment to climate. So these are unsettled times. Questions I think we have to ask ourselves as those interested in global governance is, would it be different if nature had a seat at the table? How do you engineer that? And with Sweden hosting celebrations of 50 years of UNEP in 2 years' time, and a chance to look back at how we have ill-served nature over the last 50 years, despite attempts to do our best, these are kinds of profound questions we need to ask. But COVID was a threat in plain sight. It was barreling towards us. This was not something that came up from behind and caught us unawares. We had been warned. We are being warned of the threat of what will happen to the continued loss of biodiversity. We are being warned about the continued impacts of not arresting the climate crisis. Here you see what happened in the early days of the crisis, and you see that emissions just fell away. But we know from the reports coming out this week that we've gone back to where we were before. And so this really underlines the point that while individual behavior is absolutely essential, and the hearts and minds of people are an important political tool in the challenge of the decade ahead, that in actual fact, these are deeply issues of systems change. And so if we had been warned of this, what can we do to get out of the way next time and actually solve a problem? So I've talked about some of the challenges, but let's talk about some of the alignment and the tipping points, which mean that maybe we can learn lessons from this particular moment, this nadir that we're in, and see if we can climb our way out of it. Of course, the European Union has led with a Green Deal announcement and then a COVID recovery that is embedded in that Green Deal. The proof will be in the pudding. The proof will be in the actions of individual member states of the European Union. But it has become a benchmark for what could happen around the rest of the world. We saw at the General Assembly China make its commitment to net zero by 2060. And now the details of that are being worked through, and we're seeing interesting leaks and sort of pieces of information coming out of Beijing. Japan was then forced to commit to net zero by 2050, and the Republic of Korea also forced to do the same. And you're now beginning to see a resetting about what that means for international investment beyond their own borders. I would posit that the behavior of China in the Belt and Road over the next decade will be fundamental to whether or not we can stay on the pathway that we need to be on to get to a net zero economy. And then we have the program of President-elect Biden. First of all, this was an election where you had a stark choice. You have a $2 trillion climate approach, and you had a denial in the incumbent. And now you see, as President-elect nominates his cabinet and his key advisors, that their position on climate change is fundamental to each one of the appointments he's made. And it's not just about having a climate czar and not just about having a Secretary of State who understands the need for alliances. This is about appointing Janet Yellen, for example, to the Treasury, who has profoundly understood the macroeconomic, macro-critical, macro-prudential risk that climate poses. And we're starting to see some really important trends and tipping points in the financial markets and a real pace of private sector commitment, which has not been slowed down by COVID, with more to come this year. So these crises are ones that are they're in plain sight. We are warned of them. They are barreling down the road towards us. And yet, as an international community and as nation states, we seem ill-equipped to be able to recognize them and to react to them. The COVID warning came in very many different scientific fora, but in September of last year, chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland and the former Secretary General of the International Red Cross, the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board said that we would be at risk from a rapidly spreading pandemic due to lethal respiratory pathogens. It predicted exactly what we are going through, and most people put this report on a shelf. So how do we, as we learn about the interaction between science and politics in different democratic and different non-democratic settings, how do we learn how to take climate science and really use that to act with urgency over the next decade? So now we're in a period of recovery. Can we, understanding that we were not on the right track before COVID, understanding that COVID has knocked us back, more than 100 million people now back into poverty as opposed to before COVID, extraordinary rollbacks in some of the progress that we have made. Can we get onto the path of recovery, but on a path to recovery which allows us to include more people, build economies that work better for people, and get on track for the kinds of emissions reduction and resilience that we need to see. The relief stage, I think, is still going on as different waves of the pandemic hit different worlds at different parts of the world at different times. And there is this risk of re-emergence, which has become deeply politicized in countries around the world. If you go too fast, you risk dying from the infection. If you go too slow, you risk dying from hunger. And so can we rebalance? At the heart of any rebalancing has to be an approach to One Health. We have to unite our approach to human, animal, and environmental health. This has been talked about, this has been modeled, but this now really has to come very much to the top and to the fore of global coordination and policy making. If we put nature at the table, which is a shorthand for how do we really wrestle with our interactions with nature, which are imperiling us, as we've seen from the current pandemic and from the impacts of nature's destruction, and our inability, therefore, to use nature as a solution in the climate crisis. What would happen? And we start to see some very interesting legal approaches around the world. We've seen different attempts at political approaches to allowing nature to sort of be a stakeholder in a different way. And we're starting, of course, obviously, to wrestle again with the poor economics or the economics that still do not internalize the externalities of nature. And really, our end state has to be one where we can thrive within our planetary boundaries. And so we see the importance and urgency of this. So this is really, is it a moment of reset? Are we just going to incrementally try to sort of paper over the cracks and get going? Or could we use the profoundness of this crisis, if we had the political leadership around the world, as a reset? There are glimpses of reset. It is, I think, very important in the discussion here in the United States, but also the discussion in the European Union and elsewhere in different economies around the world, to see that there is a direct line between the extraordinary amounts of public money that are going to be spent in COVID recovery going into things which will provide good, well-paying jobs in industries and activities of the future, which will be green and clean, which do allow us to build resilience at the local level. So, for example, the work of the IMF and the IEA over the summer illustrating that in order to move the energy transition forward and to recover from COVID, there was a very big sweet spot of activities related to energy efficiency in housing, in transportation, etc., related to building out the electric vehicle infrastructure that we would need to have zero emissions vehicles, by investing in some of the conversion of shipping fleets, etc., by investing heavily in the R&D needed for a green hydrogen economy that would produce good quality jobs in places where they are scarce, by investing in making our grids smarter. And this is just the sort of electricity and energy sector. You can see the same throughout the economy. So this, as I said, there's a sweet spot between investments that will provide short-term growth and income, and get people to work in sectors which will grow, medium-term growth objectives and wealth objectives, and long-term emissions reduction. Now, we have, beyond the energy crisis, we have a financial crisis, and we are going to have to solve, again, in a reset, for an indebtedness crisis and a climate crisis at the same time. So it's this question of putting scaffolding around the structures that we already have, that we use for global cooperation, but which are straining, and maybe some of the masonry is actually falling off. The attack on the World Health Organization, the attack on the Paris Agreement, although now the Biden administration has signaled very clearly that it's back. And with John Kerry as the climate czar, there's no doubt of that. But while we are putting scaffolding around so that we can limp through this year, can we next year start to design again what a world would look like? The structures that we have today were designed more than 75 years ago. They were designed at a time when half of the world was not free. They were designed for a different set of challenges. They were designed when we didn't have the kinds of technologies at our fingertips, AI, machine learning, digitalization, the liberation of information that would provide. The tools that we use to measure success are outdated, and I'll come to GDP in a minute. And our international financial institutions don't have a governance and don't have those sitting at the table who have a big stake in what is happening. And I don't just mean developing countries with a different weighted seating. I mean private equity and those who are actually holding the debt that these countries have. That would mean India and China have a very different role. So could we think about a new Bretton Woods? Could we reset at a moment of maximum risk? In great power theory, as great powers, as one wanes and one waxes, this is the moment of maximum risk. Are we at that moment in the relationship between China and the US? And where is the EU in that trilateral relationship? Is this the moment, or is it just too difficult? Is the crisis profound? Is the performance of our financial sectors globally underperforming in a way which will force us to the table? It's been interesting to see Africa generate their own ideas about how to move through their indebtedness crisis and be able to get themselves onto a path to net zero, and to build the resilience that they need to cope with pandemics and future threats. I think the proposal that's come from the Economic Commission of Africa for a repurchasing scheme of African debt by European central banks in return for green investment, or perhaps issues of sovereign performance bonds. These show that there is innovation and there's a possibility, but it's not building off what we've already got. It really is sitting back and asking ourselves a different question. And it requires what Greta Thunberg calls cathedral thinking. What we build today will have to serve us over the next 10, 20, 30 years. It won't serve us just in this political cycle. And as those who built the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe in centuries before, as they worked as stonemasons, what they were building was never going to be appreciated by them. It was going to be appreciated by their children and their grandchildren. So can we find it within ourselves to build something now that will last and serve us well over this extraordinary 30-year period where we have to decarbonise our economies and make them work for everyone. At the core of this is, what is the measure of success? Different countries have experimented with wellness budgets, with well-being matrices, with happiness indices, with natural capital accounting, all kinds of mechanisms. But really, is this now, after years of operating under a system which does not value investment in social welfare, health and education, and does not value nature when it is in situ, is this really the moment where we have to think about the metrics at the heart of the system that we need in order to move out of COVID, prepare ourselves for the next zoonotic pandemic, prepare ourselves for rolling climate crises because of the pollution we have put in the atmosphere over the last 30 years, and at a world where the destruction of nature is still outpacing our ability to even comprehend the risks that we are storing up for ourselves. This is a moment for reset. I think we have the tools. I certainly have the money sort of sloshing around in the global economy. I think we have a reset of community attitudes to their own resilience, an appreciation of global and local unlike ever before. Can we put in place the political leaders and give them the mandate to build something now that will serve us well for 20 to 30 years? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this very wide and interesting talk on where we are and where we should go. I would like to put one question to you, and that is the suggestion that you are proposing to put nature at the table and also to think around the new institutions in the way you described. How have reactions been to such proposals? Where are those issues discussed today?
Well, I think there's a very interesting unity emerging from sort of the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Managing Director of the IMF, in that they are very clear that there's only one sort of problem set in front of leaders at the moment, and that is a COVID recovery that will allow us to achieve zero net emissions. And I use that as a shorthand for the radical decarbonisation that needs to take place, and the resilience that countries will need, the adaptation. And so they are not talking about having, COVID recovery conversations and then having climate conversations. They're talking about that being one problem set, and that we have to solve those in one sort of work stream. So I think that's extraordinary. And if you think back over climate negotiations of the past, the critical relationship in the run-up to Paris was between the president of the World Bank and the Secretary General of the UN. I think now the critical relationship is between the IMF and the UN. And I think that's interesting because it indicates, that the IMF is beginning to really go beyond the sort of the rhetorical approach to climate and inclusion under Christine Lagarde, and is actually now, through the words and actions of Gyte Gopinaal and the research units at the IMF, is really embracing a post-austerity sort of new way of thinking about the global economy. It begs a question of where is the multilateral development bank world at the moment. It isn't a question of how much of their lending should be done on climate or on COVID recovery. It's a question that nothing that multilateral development finance should be doing now should be outside of the parameters of achieving net zero. So that's a sort of different, again, it's a different question to multilateral finance. I think we're just about to see a new head of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi. I think that the pathway has been cleared for her. I don't want to preempt the decisions of member states in January, but putting somebody who understands finance development in the heart of the World Trade Organization gives us a chance to see if we can bring a trade regime alongside a climate negotiation and alongside an economic reset conversation. I think and then my final point is that there's a lot of eyes on Boris Johnson and the UK government and on the Italian government at the moment. they will chair the G7 and G20 respectively in the same year that they will be the co-presidents of the COP and the climate negotiations. And so this is well within the capacity of a British Foreign Office team to call together the holders of debt, for example, around a different table, to lay the table differently, and to be creative in their presidency around some of the conversations that need to happen and some of the solutions that could come forward.
Thank you, Rachel. So now I would like to invite our two panelists into the picture, Mattias Frimeri and Mats Granrud. Mattias is the head of the Swedish delegation to UN FCCC and member of the UN FCCC Standing Committee on Finance. Welcome. And Mats,
thank you.
Mats is the Director General of the GSMA Association, an industry organization that represents the interests of mobile networks operations worldwide. You are also on the board of Vattenfall and a former CEO and president of Tele2 here in Sweden.
Yeah.
So I would like to start by giving you the word, Mattias, to give us some introductory remarks, please.
Thanks, Mia, and thanks for inviting me to join you here. And thanks also to Rachel for those very wide-ranging remarks, which sort of dwarves, I think, what the climate perspective, which I could maybe bring you in some introductory remarks. But just maybe to pick up on the point which you made sort of towards the end, and the holistic approach which I would hope that we can be pursuing in the recovery from the crisis. And the kind of language we're using is sort of healthy people, healthy planet, and a green and healthy recovery, and making sure that we're sort of bringing forward the climate, health, and biodiversity agendas in an integrated fashion. Now, obviously, as policymakers, there is a challenge to make sure that you on the one hand, actually have a policy which integrates these various perspectives, but maybe even more challenging is to make, how do we find ways to implement those kind of policies in this joined up fashion, and not only nationally but also multilaterally. And I mean, I won't attempt to answer that question today, but it's definitely something which we're, from the Swedish side, trying to advance both bilaterally and within multilateral institutions, sort of to bring about that kind of holistic approach to recovery. And maybe just another note on that as well, where we're talking about sort of building back better. And I think specifically IMF colleagues are talking about sort of building forward and not wanting sort of to go back to what we had before, and to make that point that we need to build something which is more sustainable in the long run. Maybe focusing more on sort of on the world of climate negotiations and climate action. I mean, as Rachel highlighted in her introductory remarks, I mean, I think we've seen some encouraging signs for the past couple of months now, with China, Japan, and South Korea coming forward with their net zero targets. There have been further NDCs coming in, even maybe not at this pace we would have hoped for, the national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And obviously we have the new EU 2030 target hopefully being decided now in December, and of course the incoming US administration with hopefully them setting a net zero target for 2050 as well. So with the US on board, we have a large part of the world economy and a large part of global emissions aiming for net zero targets by mid-century or shortly thereafter. That gives us sort of the global community a sense of urgency, hopefully, because we need to act now. IPCC, the UN climate panel, has been saying repeatedly that we need to cut emissions by half by 2030. And in order to do that, obviously we need to start working now. It's not something we can do sort of in 2030, but that work needs to start now, and it is starting now. I think what's encouraging from our side is also to see the engagement from the private sector and the financial sector, maybe in particular, where individual companies and alliances are taking steps to sort of both make commitments to net zero and also showcasing the kind of examples we're seeing, for example, now we have the hybrid plant in northern Sweden, the pilot plant for fossil-free steel production. One of the LKAB, the Swedish mining company, announced a large investment just the other day on making their whole production fossil-free by mid-century. So we're seeing new kind of production methods coming forward, and hopefully also being, not only developed in Sweden but in Europe, across Europe, and also globally. And from a Swedish perspective, we naturally see also here this is an export potential for Swedish companies in exporting their products and services, aiming for to support the climate, the transition to climate neutrality globally. And I think that also links to the whole green recovery debate, where the IMF makes estimates that some 12,000 billion euro dollars have been set aside in fiscal measures across the world by governments in the past couple of months to support us coming out of the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. If we make good use of those investments, we have an opportunity to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, and come out of the economic crisis in an even stronger fashion to be able to meet the climate crisis. And obviously this is a joint both opportunity for us to have, where we as governments, government representatives, and also companies can seize this opportunity to make sure that we're making the best use of those kind of investments that we're seeing now. I was in a conversation just this morning with one of the Swedish financial actors, also part of one of the global alliances for net zero, which was launched at the UN Climate Action Summit this last year, where the work they're doing to demand from the investments they're making, that they need to show that they're on track to being aligned with the Paris Agreement. I think those kind of movements will also help society to bring about the kind of transition that we need to see. So there's a lot of positive development going on. We're seeing development within countries. We're seeing developments within the business sector and the financial sector, and we're seeing developments also within actors like cities. We have the C40 Alliance with a large number of cities across the world taking climate action on their level. And all of these various initiatives are important for us to be able to deliver on the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, and also showcasing that the transition is possible. And I think that's one of the key messages that we need to take with us and be ambassadors for. That the transition is possible. That it's not going to be easy, and it will cost money, but in the end, this is what will bring about the new kind of economy, which Rachel also was talking about in her introductory remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthias. Before giving the floor to Mats, I would really like you to come here and give a few remarks here before we started the question session. But I would like to remind you that whenever you have a question, please put it in writing in the Q&A function. So Mats, floor is yours, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Mia. And thank you for having me here today. It is really a great pleasure, and it's inspiring to listen to both you, Matthias, and Rachel, to give your overview. So I represent the mobile industry, and the industry that connects 2/3 of everyone on this planet, so roughly 5.2 billion people. And we have an economic contribution to the world's GDP of roughly $4.1 trillion. Now, this reach brings some serious responsibility, and especially this year, as billions of people are relying on mobile access for almost everything we do, from work and education to connecting with family and friends to providing health information as we collectively fight this pandemic, this virus. Now, we have robust, resilient, and secure networks thanks to the infrastructure investments made by mobile operators over many, many years. COVID-19, though, brings a new opportunity to take action on climate change as countries adjust infrastructure, jobs, and investments, as we have heard both from Rachel and from Matthias. We can build on developments such as the EU Green Deal and start conversations about risk and resilience. Extreme weather events, flooding, and loss of electricity are threats to the planet and a serious risk to the infrastructure built by my industry. So climate change really matters on many levels for the mobile industry. And as we all rely more and more on mobile phones, our customers, our employees, and our investors needs us to act. And we are acting in 3 ways. Firstly, we are adapting to the change of climate. We need to understand how climate change will affect our infrastructure assets and help others to understand that as well. Now, AT&T in the US has developed a climate change analysis tool with the Department of Energy to better anticipate and adapt to climate change. And the data is being made available to the public so that universities, municipalities, and anyone who needs it can use it in their own climate risk analysis. And secondly, number 2, limiting our carbon emissions and doing it quickly to limit global warming to the famous 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, we as an industry, we are committed to moving the mobile industry to a net zero emissions by 2050 at the very latest. Today, 52% of the mobile industry by revenue has set science-based targets, and of those, roughly half are aligned to a net zero by 2050. And we expect this number to grow significantly ahead of COP26, which is in just 1 year in the UK. And thirdly, helping others to limit their emissions, where smart connected tech can reduce emissions across all sectors. Today, mobile sector emissions from constructing and running networks to manufacturing and using handsets are roughly 0.4% of total global emission. But by applying smart connectivity, we can enable carbon emissions reductions that are 10 times that of the industry emissions. So roughly 4% of global emissions can be addressed. Now, this we expect that we can double by 2025, giving a savings of roughly 8%, which is significant. Now, you may wonder why, wonder how. Well, it is a result of behavior change from smartphone usage, like e-banking, online shopping, ride-sharing, video calling, using Zoom and less travel as Rachel and I am doing, and smart connected technologies such as smart buildings, smart energy grids, smart manufacturing, smart agriculture, and smart cities. The C40 initiative that Matthias mentioned is one of those initiatives. But it is also an opportunity to change what we have already always done and develop entirely new ways of approaching a problem. So let me give you just one example. Mobile money, M-Pesa in Africa, was first launched some 12 years ago through cooperation between GSMA and the UK's Department for International Development, or DFID as it was called. Now today, there are more than 1 billion mobile money accounts transacting more than $2 billion each day. And in addition to being secure and traceable and improving livelihoods, mobile money has been instrumental in the rapid growth of pay-as-you-go solar solutions, which allows financially vulnerable people to switch away from traditional fuels like firewood, kerosene, and gas, and to start use renewable energy source as solar power. It's a great way of using technology and completely changing the game. So let's encourage digital innovation to tackle climate change. Now, we believe firmly that the decarbonized world is a digital world. Using a smartphone for 1 year consumes roughly 60 kilograms of CO2. And that is equivalent to driving your car for 300 kilometers or the production of 8 beef burgers. Yeah, just 8. So an increased use of smart technology will both reduce emission, enhance our lives, and create jobs. It will enhance our prosperity. So as I said in the beginning, climate change really matters to the mobile industry. And we need to act fast, cross sectors, and implement smart solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that inspiring talk, Mats. Before I give the floor to, we have a question coming in from the audience. Are there any comments, Rachel, to what you've heard from your panelist friends?
Well, thank you. Well, I think just first of all, just to Mats's optimistic, rightly so, recounting of how technology and digitalization is going to help. This is every aspect of everything we do and every aspect of the economy. So what digitalization can do to the performance of grids, what mobile telephone technology can do to actually inclusion, what that means. I worked extensively on extending energy access, clean energy access to those who don't have it, and it allows you to think about a decentralized world operating within sort of centralized and global supply chains as well. And so it really liberates us to think about providing services at a local level, building resilience, and not having to wait for a centralized system to eventually reach you at an exorbitant cost. And I think that that's beginning now to sort of filter through the way that solutions are being thought of. But I think that there's still this sort of great incumbency and inertia in a lot of planning sort of that happens around the world. And so we have this extraordinary speed of technological sort of revolution and digitalization, and then sort of planning systems which are very embedded in the way we've done them for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And those two things ill serve the poor mainly. And so it is having the courage to back some of what the private sector is already being able to bring to the table. So in a world where your car powers your house, in a world where your phone allows you to determine how much water and electricity you're using, and this is a profound democratization of energy systems and water systems, things like that. And I don't think we've fully yet got our mind all around that. And that optimism is difficult to implant into climate negotiations, I think. So I think we sort of see a world at multiple speeds at the moment.
Thank you. I have one question here from Lena Ek, former Swedish Minister for Environment.
Lena Ek, yes.
She asks, the former climate regime with the Kyoto Protocol was bogged down by increasing details and bureaucracy. Sadly, I see the same tendency now with the Paris Agreement. How can this be avoided? And where are the leaders that can see the overall picture? Who wants to take that?
Matthias.
Yes.
No, not sort of pointing to the leaders, but to just sort of to highlight that I think what we should do probably is sort of to also make a distinction between these mega meetings like the COPs are and what's actually going on in countries. And I think that's sort of a useful reminder we've been given with the COVID situation now that we're not actually able to meet. I mean, we should have been in Glasgow for the past 2 weeks, basically, and negotiating, the various ins and outs of the Paris rule book. And that's one thing. But then what's going on at the country level, is I shouldn't say it's a completely different thing, but it's definitely something else. Because you're seeing climate action on a country level, which is not maybe manifested in the kind of negotiating rooms we have at the COPs. And I think there's something we need to work on here as well, because obviously, when we saw, for example, last year, and when we met in Madrid, there were these huge expectations on what the COP was going to deliver. We had youth demanding action, and civil society groups in general, demanding action. And I think, one of the reflections coming out from COP25 in Madrid was that the expectations obviously were not met. And I think one of the reasons for being so, for the expectations not having been met, is that they were not sort of set, we were never set to deliver those kind of expectations in the COP meeting itself, because that's not what the COPs do. We negotiate rules and regulations for how to implement the Paris Agreement, reporting methods and so forth. It's not so much about the national climate action. So I think there's a need for sort of some kind of a distinction between the rules and regulations negotiated in the COPs and actually what happens at country level. And obviously what's going on at country level could be manifested at those kind of meetings. But I think we might be looking to something where we can be highlighting this kind of action more sort of not only at the COPs, but more sort of as an ongoing process. And that itself will hopefully also encourage action in more countries when you're seeing that it's not a one-off opportunity once every year when we're doing this.
Thank you, Matthias. Could I ask you a touch on the point you raised, or what you raised at the end, Matthias? On December 12th, the Paris Agreement is celebrating its 5th anniversary. And there are hopes that countries will update their commitments, because I think many researchers say that even what's in the Paris Agreement today is not enough in order to avoid the serious climate damages by the end of the century. What are the hopes that countries will update their commitments given the crisis we're in? What do you think? Rachel, do you have
we should over. Sorry.
Go ahead, Matthias. I'll follow on from
sorry.
you.
No, you start.
Well, I think that I think there's a hope that on the 12th there would be around about 70 countries that have either filed their NDC or with more ambition, or who have made a long-term commitment to net zero. That's a number that I've heard in New York, and I think that there is a lot of work going on around making sure that some of the very important sectoral commitments that came out of the Climate Action Summit last year are continuing to move forward and continuing to bite down. So, that's green steel, which Sweden led on. That's net zero vessels in shipping, which Denmark has been leading on. Some of that work is really actually moving quite quickly. And then I think there is this whole question of finance. And if I can just take a minute on that. So this is another area where what goes on in the COP and what's going on in the real world is slightly misaligned or misunderstood. So politically, within the climate negotiations, there is a commitment that by 2020 there would be 100 billion a year for climate finance, and that this would not be this would be in addition to other forms of finance which might be used for issues of adaptation, etc. There's recently been an expert group come forward with, and I think they're giving a number of about 79 billion. So we're 21 billion short, and it's become a litmus test for the political commitment of rich nations to a process where developing countries find themselves, engulfed by climate impacts that they didn't do anything to originate. Now, park that conversation and look at what's happened in the financial markets over the last few months, and then look at what's happening amongst central bank governors. And you see stress tests coming in by central banks. You've got more than 50, I think, central banks now working as part of the NGFS. You have the Bank of England now with an RFP for consulting firms to help banks and conduct a stress test, which means that any company that is banking with any bank that is registered in London is going to have to submit to the TCFD, is going to have to be transparent about its own emissions and how it expects to be able to conduct business in a decarbonising society. This is going to start going very, very fast now, and the insurance companies are moving, pension funds, etc. So what I think is that, and it also goes back to Lena Ek's question, which is that this is beginning to be mainstream. And so what is the role of the COP when actually climate as a risk is now a mainstream issue for ministries of finance, central bank governors, etc. So I think we're at a very interesting point, and we hope that on December the 12th there is another sort of slight sort of sense that we are moving forward, although I think it's bad timing for many countries in terms of submitting an NDC.
Thank you.
Matthias, I don't know what you think.
Please, Matthias.
Yeah, maybe just to add to another of those initiatives, we also have a coalition of finance ministers for climate action, which was launched about a year ago, which now I think comprises some 40 or 50 ministers of finance, including the Swedish finance minister, who is also leading on one of the 6 principles within that coalition on working on carbon pricing.
Yeah.
Which you would know from the Swedish side, we've had that as a successful example of driving climate action for the past, 20, 30 years. And we're seeing that being introduced more and more in other jurisdictions around the world as well. And I think that's also an example of a policy which IMF have been highlighting now during the recovery, that this is a good time to introduce carbon pricing measures. And who knows, we might even see that sort of more on a global scale going forward. But I think also on the 12th, as Rachel was saying, we're hoping for substantive commitments coming forward from a number of countries. As I said, the commitments from China, Japan, and South Korea are going to be manifested once again, and also hopefully from the European Union, and also these other kind of financial commitments.
Thank you, Mats. It feels sometimes like the business and private sector is ahead of governments in terms of taking action. How would you react to saying that? Is business or in private sector reactive, or are you already now looking ahead, and you are going to see policy changes in the carbon price or regulation coming on? And also that you see that demand from consumers are putting this issue high on their agenda. What's driving what's happening?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. And I have huge respect for policy making and politicians generally. This is a very complex area, obviously, with the whole SDGs and sustainability. But for business, I would say that staying where we are today is not sustainable. As I said in my little speech here, our employees, our customers, our investors are demanding, and they are sort of rewarding companies that have a clear agenda and a clear view on this. And obviously, being a business leader, it is in a way much simpler, because we only have the company to run, if you would like. So it is easier. And I think, back to what we said about being bogged down in politics, I think the timing of COVID, as horrible as it is, has been actually quite beneficial of propelling not only technology, but the way of sustainable thinking in sort of almost in a turbocharged mode, you can say. And at the same time, we're getting much more traction with science-based target and TCFD, which means that what we measure, it gets done. Previously, we have only been talking and trying to adapt to a policy or an interest is very complicated. But now we have measures, we have targets, we have the 17 goals, SDGs, giving us a fantastic framework to start to think about how can I sort of focus on 13, which is climate, or 4, which is education, or whatever it might be. Or 5, which is gender equality. It gives me a framework. It gives me a almost like a purpose, you can say. And then couple that with means and measures and the driving force from the key stakeholders. I think we have actually a fairly benign environment right now to continue to push. And I see a lot of interest from my industry and adjacent industries as well, to be honest.
Thank you. Having had a number of economists on the different sessions, and also in different seminars that we had before at SNS, it's obvious that the carbon price and a global carbon price, high enough, is something that that is being pushed as the most important measure. At the same time, it's not on the negotiation table today. Also, there are companies that do work with an internal carbon price in order to have that as an incentive for this transformation that you are describing, Mats. I was wondering, what is your view on the possibility to start discussions or to have more discussions on the issue of carbon price and a global carbon price? I would like to end on that note, and then we will have to finish. Rachel, I give the floor to you, please.
Well, I think it's necessary but insufficient. I think it also now really it's an effective carbon price. So a lot of the internal prices that many companies have set, and some of the carbon prices that have been introduced in different jurisdictions around the world really aren't in line with where we would need to be, where that price needs to be in order to get the speed of transition necessary. So I think that carbon prices of $30-40 a euro are not effective, and so I think it's both a question of introducing pricing alongside a raft of other policy measures, including driving efficiency, investing in R&D for the new technologies, and then making sure that the technologies that are already available are actually being deployed, which is another big question for another seminar. So they're necessary but insufficient, and then really, we need prices which are north of 100, between 100 and 200, depending on different assessments. And I think I touched on green hydrogen just as a very precise example, right? So we there's a lot of enthusiasm about green hydrogen now that we can build that with excess wind capacity for offshore wind, etc., or excess solar where that's being installed. But you're going to need a demand for that hydrogen. And so that's precisely where an effective carbon price would start shifting, for example, trucking and shipping and also industrial customers into demanding green hydrogen. So we'll get there, but we would go much faster if we had an effective price. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have to stop here. And I really want to thank you for your contribution. And as you said, this is just it's a starter for so many more important discussions that we need. And I would like to say that you mentioned the role of the financial market and also the way things are going forward also within the institutions. And the next session we have in the Tylösand Summit is on that issue tomorrow, with Sarah Breeden from the Bank of England being the keynote speaker. So you're all very much welcome to follow us there. The other thing I wanted to say when it comes to webinars, we're having, in collaboration with IMF, a webinar on the chapter on climate change mitigation from the World Economic Outlook that was published in October. That is happening on the 8th of December, and you will see more on our webpage. And also you will find more about our speakers from the sessions we've had and for the one tomorrow on the webpage. With those words, I really want to thank our speakers and also you in the audience. Thank you very much and hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.